coyotes moving between the beach houses at night, carrying red wolf ancestry that no longer appears in any living red wolf, captive or released. Most people hear extinct as a date on a document. The red wolf got one, 1980, signed by the federal government. Nothing here rests on a sighting. More than 400 canids went into the rescue that produced that date. Heppenheimer's team sequenced what got left outside it and published in Genes in 2018. 5 files, 5 animals that are still out there inside something wearing a different name. Every conservation headline you read is standing on a threshold somebody drew by hand. The threshold never makes the headline. You get the word, extinct, pure, recovered, and the number that produced it stays in a filing cabinet in Texas. 2 of these 5 were never declared extinct. Nobody ever had to declare them anything, and that is the part worth staying for. Does a lineage that survives only inside another species still count as extinct? Southern Ontario, early 20th century. Wolves are hunted out of the region until the breeding populations collapse. Coyotes move in from the west into the space that opens up, and the 2 animals breed along that edge. What came out is now spread across the northeastern United States and eastern Canada. Majority coyote by ancestry, carrying wolf and carrying domestic dog. Kays and colleagues documented the physical side in 2010. The eastern animals are bigger than western coyotes, with larger skulls. They spread east across the 20th century and arrived built differently than the ones that started the trip. No agency planned it. Coyotes walked into a landscape where the resident predator had been shot out, and they bred with whatever was left of it. The wolf ancestry in those animals came out of a population Ontario spent a century clearing. It is riding around tonight inside coyotes crossing suburban lawns in Massachusetts. Every case that follows has paperwork behind it. A capture list, a release order, a rule with a date. This one happened while the paperwork was busy somewhere else. Nobody signed anything to make the coy-wolf. In Texas and Louisiana, somebody signed. The red wolf was declared extinct in the wild in 1980. Before that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put a man named Curtis Carley on the Gulf Coast with orders to pull the last of the species out of the marsh. More than 400 canids came in. 43 were judged red wolf enough to ship to a zoo in Tacoma. 17 of those 43 passed the second round. 14 of the 17 bred. 14 out of more than 400. Everything we call a red wolf today came out of those 14 animals. The rest were released or removed as coyote or coyote hybrid. They kept doing what canids do. In 2018, Heppenheimer and colleagues published in the journal Genes on coyotes sampled at Galveston Island, off the Texas coast. The Galveston animals are coyotes. Majority coyote by ancestry, living as coyotes, breeding as coyotes. The sequencing found red wolf alleles in them anyway, and some of those alleles no longer exist in the captive population. Material that never got through Carley's filter was sitting on a barrier island 4 decades later. The capture program worked. Every red wolf alive exists because of it, and animals were later released in North Carolina, which is a recovery record almost nothing else on the list can match. You're already thinking it. In 2016, the same Princeton lab published whole genomes arguing the red wolf is itself an admixture, somewhere between 9 and 20% gray wolf, the rest coyote. If the red wolf is a mixture, what is surviving on Galveston? Fair question. The answer is that those alleles are gone from every living captive animal either way. Whatever you call the thing, those variants exist in one place on Earth. Carley's filter was skull x-rays, body measurements and recordings of the animal's calls, applied in the 1970s, before anyone in that room could sequence anything. He was working with the tools he had. The tools could not see what the Galveston coyotes were carrying. The Gulf Coast program sorted canids by how much wolf they carried. 15 years later in Florida, the same agency paid to put a different subspecies into a population on purpose. The Florida panther was listed as endangered on the 11th of March, 1967. Federal Register Volume 32, page 4001, the same notice that carries the red wolf. A remnant population held on, down to roughly 20 to 30 animals by the time of the 1995 release, and those animals showed what that number does to a genome. Kinked tails, cowlicks in the fur, cryptorchidism in the males, holes in the wall between the chambers of the heart, which is a defect called an atrial septal defect. The tails and the cowlicks show up in photographs. The heart defect shows up in necropsies. In 1995, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission released 8 female Texas cougars into South Florida. Puma concolor stanleyana, a different subspecies, brought in to breed with the panthers on purpose. Johnson and colleagues published the outcome in Science in 2010. The defects declined, the population climbed. Puma concolor stanleyana and the Florida panther are the same species. The 1995 release hybridized nothing, and that is worth saying out loud before anyone says it for me. But the rule those cougars were flying under was already in trouble, and 2 people had said so in public 4 years earlier. Stephen O'Brien and Ernst Mayr, in Science, in 1991, under the title Bureaucratic Mischief. Their case was that the 2 flagship animals of the Endangered Species Act would both lose protection if the hybrid rule were applied as written. The Florida panther, because a puma from South America had escaped a roadside zoo and bred into the population. The red wolf, because the evidence was already pointing at a hybrid origin. Neither man was an opponent of the act. Mayr wrote the species concept most of this argument runs on. The people saying the category was broken were the people who had built the categories. So look at where subspecies come from. Somebody measures a set of animals, publishes a description, and the boundary holds until somebody else measures again. In 1995, the Texas cougars counted as a legitimate rescue. In the 1970s, the Galveston coyotes counted as disposable. Both judgments came out of the same profession, working within the same few decades, applying the same kind of reasoning to the same question about how much mixing is too much. A category that gets revised whenever someone publishes is doing a different job than the animals it is applied to. The coyotes on Galveston Island have been the same animals since 1980. The Panther paper came out in Science in 2010. The memo that decides what happens to animals like these was written 33 years earlier. By 1981, it had already been tested on a bird. The dusky seaside sparrow lived in the marshes of Merritt Island and along the St. Johns River in Florida. Dark, heavily streaked, a bird small enough to sit in a closed hand. Mosquito control flooding and marsh drainage took the habitat through the 1960s and 70s. This is the only animal in this episode where the hybrid line died too. No wild population, no captive one either. By the time anyone moved, no dusky females remained. The surviving males were bred to female Scott's seaside sparrows, a related subspecies from Florida's Gulf Coast. The offspring were bred back to dusky males, again and again. The program reached birds reported at 7/8 dusky ancestry, 7 parts out of 8, in an animal whose own kind no longer existed. There are 2 documents, same office, 4 months apart. May 1977, the solicitor of the Department of the Interior answers a routine question from Fish and Wildlife Law Enforcement. His reading is that the act does cover hybrids because the statute defines fish or wildlife to include any offspring without limitation. Then the biologists reach him. Their concern is genetic swamping, a common animal breeding into a rare one until the rare one is gone. August 1977, same office. The May opinion is overturned and replaced. Hybrid offspring of listed species receive no protection under the Endangered Species Act. Put the 2 1977 memos next to each other, May and August. Same desk, opposite answers. Does that mean somebody was lying in May? Not necessarily. The swamping problem was real, and it is still real. A blanket bar closes off an obvious abuse, which is breeding a common animal into a rare one and handing the government the bill. The distance between May and August is the whole argument, and both ends of it are dated. May 1981, the solicitor's office applies the August version to the sparrows. The back-crossed birds are not dusky seaside sparrows, regardless of how many generations you run. They get no protection, and federal money cannot be spent on the project. 7/8 was still hybrid. The rule did not measure fractions. The last dusky seaside sparrow was a male banded orange band. He died on the 16th of June, 1987 at Discovery Island at Walt Disney World. The subspecies was formally delisted in December 1990. The same month, the sparrow came off the list, the 14th of December 1990. The office that wrote the rule put in writing that its own position needed revisiting. Hybridization, they said, is more properly a biological question than a legal one. 5 years after that, the agencies proposed a policy saying intercross progeny may warrant protection where they conserve the genetic material of a listed taxon. 9 years separate the death of orange band from that sentence. Avise and Nelson published in Science in 1989, 2 years after orange band died. Their mitochondrial work found no support for the dusky as a distinct lineage. The rescue may have been aimed at a bird that was never separate to begin with. The 1996 policy is in the Federal Register, Volume 61, page 4710, public and searchable. The 1977 memos are internal interior correspondence. They live in the law review literature that dug them out, and Kevin Hill's 1993 piece in the Boston College Environmental Affairs Law Review is where to start. 20 minutes to check the lot without taking my word for any of it. Subscribing is what puts the next one of these in front of you. One file left. It opens in 1889, and the animal in it is on the seal of the Department of the Interior. William Hornaday counted the survivors for the Smithsonian in 1889. 1,091 animals in all of North America. 256 of them were wild plains bison, out of a population that had covered the interior of the continent. What saved the survivors was private ranching. And some of those ranchers were crossing bison with domestic cattle. Charles Jones, Mossam Boyd. The crosses ran through the 1880s into the early 1900s. The result was called Catalo, a commercial venture aimed at hardy beef stock rather than a conservation program. Those animals went into the same small pool that everything alive today descends from. Halbert and Dare published the survey in 2007. 11 federal herds, cattle DNA in the nuclear genome of 7 of them. 4 came back clean. Only 2 of the 4 had enough samples to say so with confidence. One of those 2 is Yellowstone. So the standard exists. It is standing in Wyoming, and it has never been written into anything. Now hold the 2 standards next to each other. 14. 14 out of more than 400, and the filter that produced them was a judgment about how much wolf each animal was carrying. That threshold landed on an animal nobody was selling. No tourism campaign, no federal letterhead, and the only constituency it had was the agency that listed it. In 2016, the bison was signed into law as the national mammal of the United States, with no ancestry test attached. The threshold that produced 14 has never been applied to the animal on the seal. It would not survive the attempt. Galveston Island, Texas. Salt grass and sand off the Gulf Coast. Thin scrub behind the dune line. Coyotes moving between the beach houses at night. Samples went to a lab at Princeton and came back with red wolf ancestry in them. Ancestry that no longer appears in any living red wolf, captive or released. 14 out of more than 400. One threshold, applied by hand in the 1970s. Heppenheimer and colleagues found the material in 2018. It had been on the island the whole time, under a category set by people judging how much mixing was too much, with the tools available to them in the decade they were working in. The intercross policy that would have told the agency what to do with animals like these was proposed in February 1996. 3 decades later, it has still never been finalized. 14 founders decided what counts as a red wolf. 7 of 11 federal bison herds carry cattle DNA, and no line has ever been drawn for them. Another one of these is already in the paperwork. Subscribe.